My name is Lorraine Waldner. I've been coming to Riverwood now since June of this year. I attend the 9:15 service at the warehouse. I was raised in a religious home, in very religious environment. I always knew of God, but I was terrified of God. Everything in my home and environment in which I was raised essentially was around how one conducted themselves. And as long as you perform well, look well, act well, you will be well. And for me, that was not the case. I had my first drink of alcohol at 15 years of age. For me, drinking alcohol was the perfect escape. It was the way to escape reality. It was a way to really survive. It was the only thing that kept me alive. It really wasn't until after the failed suicide attempt that I saw how long I had been living in an absolutely hopeless place and how desperate I was for change. And that what I had thought was an answer had turned into my biggest nightmare. That what was supposed to be a solution was the thing that just about took me out. When I came out of the hospital and I looked at the faces of my family, and I simply knew I couldn't do it anymore. For me, being a recovering addict means being a human being with hope and dignity and value and worth again, and all of the things that I worked so hard to have and never could attain on my own. In recovery, in reconnecting with God, in recognizing the way that He looks at me, that I already have value. I already have all of that. And He's never changed in all of the things that I did or that others did to me. He never changed. I think that when I look at community and what we need to be for addicts, what a community needs to be in order for an addict like myself, for example, if we'll just be the kind of people that someone can come to, I think that is the best thing that we can possibly be. I know that that's what my community has been for me. For a church to have the kind of culture that says, come just as you are. Don't leave your baggage at the door. Bring it in with you, because it's okay. God already knows about it, and it doesn't change His opinion of us one little bit. In fact, the only way that He can begin to work with us is when we can recognize that He loves us exactly where we are. That's when He can begin to touch those places that we don't want anyone to know about or touch. And that's, for me, where healing begins.
I want to welcome you who are in the warehouse and at the fire hall, Churchill, and are watching online. It It is so good to have you share in this, and I just want to thank you as a church for having me here these last 3 weeks. I hope you have found it helpful to look at both the science and the Bible to realize they don't contradict. They just help us have a fuller understanding of life. Week 1, we looked at what is addiction, what's going on in the brain. Last week, we looked at what's complex trauma, how does that set a person up for addiction. And today's our last sermon in this series, and I think you're probably thinking, I hope he says something helpful this week, because I'm sure tired of being told how messed up I am. So I am going to try and give you a little bit of guidance about where to go from here. What are the first steps to begin to find healing? I think you realize that I can, in a 30-minute sermon, give you all of the tools you're going to need for recovery, for healing, for dealing with trauma. It takes me 6 months to teach that at React, and I can't do that in 30 minutes, but I want to get you started. And I want to give you 3 very foundational things that are necessary to understand at the very beginning of this healing journey in recovery from addiction and from complex trauma. I want to start with a science part again, but I want to combine it with the Bible. There was a historian that said God's written science and God wrote the Bible. He's the author of both. They don't contradict, but they give us a fuller understanding. So in the book of Proverbs, over and over we hear about a wise man and a foolish man. And it says a wise man does this, a foolish man does that, and that's the theme of the book of Proverbs. It's when we look at the brain that we begin to understand how does a foolish man work and how does a wise man work. And it just gives us so much insight into foolishness and wisdom that I hope you kind of get excited about it. I want to show you a brain, and in that brain you're going to see 3 parts. So there's that, looks like a carrot going down, that's your brain stem. That is what first develops when the baby's in the womb. That controls all your life functions, your heartbeat, your blood pressure, your breathing, digestion, all this stuff that deals with organs and glands that you don't even think about. It just handles all of that. And when that dies, you are dead. The second part is above it, that orange ball called your limbic system. That goes by kind of 2 titles. The first is that's the brain of a child. That's what develops in infancy and through childhood. And it's the emotion center of the brain. It's where you feel pleasure and pain, anger, fear. All of that takes place in the limbic system. And then above that is the cerebral cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain. That develops into your 30s. And that is what enables you to analyze and judge things and weigh out pros and cons and decide whether to follow your emotions or to follow some impulse inside of you. That's the mature part, the adult part of your brain. Now, I want you to understand that the limbic brain operates on a very different guidance system than the cerebral cortex, the adult brain. So the child brain, it uses 2 things to guide whether a decision is wise. So the first decision or the first parameter is, will it give me pleasure and will it keep me safe? And the second is, will it do it right now? So if you think of if you offered to a child broccoli or a chocolate bar, their limbic brain would say the wise decision here is a chocolate bar because it gives me instant pleasure, instant gratification. So you see the limbic brain, it doesn't think 20 years down the road where you got all kinds of health problems because you ate chocolate bars all your life. It just thinks instant pleasure now, and that's how it bases every decision. The cerebral cortex, it bases the wisdom of a decision not on how it makes me feel now, but what I'll be like down the road. It thinks long term. And so it is thinking, I should eat my broccoli even though I don't like it a lot, because in 20 years I'll be glad I did. And so it weighs decisions out by, is it healthy long term? Is it loving long term? And if it is loving long term and healthy long term, it might be painful right now, but I'll go through it because it will pay off in the end. What I want you to understand is this. Complex trauma, or a child growing up not feeling safe, is your limbic brain. That's your fear center. And so, complex trauma people who live in danger all the time and who have fear all the time, they get stuck in the child brain. So if you talk to an addict, their thinking is, will it give me pleasure now or keep me safe? That's all I care about. They don't think long term. All they care about is the now. So here is the challenge. For a person coming into recovery who might be 40, 50 years old, they're still stuck in their child brain, instant gratification. And what you're trying to tell these people is, you got to start thinking long term. Now that's a challenge, because what happens in the fear, the limbic brain, is that the brain secretes a chemical called cortisol. And cortisol is what gives you that adrenaline burst so that you can fight or flight. So if you get fear, then you can run faster or fight harder because of cortisol. But what that cortisol does is it gives you this intense emotional escalation. So in a nanosecond, you can go from being cool to being angry and ready to kill somebody. So what you're saying to a person in recovery is, now you're going to walk into situations and you're going to be afraid, and your limbic system is going to get fired up by cortisol, and it's going to pull you in a nanosecond to want to do something. Stop and make a different decision. In that nanosecond, change your coping strategy. That is super, super hard. And not many people do it well the first time. It takes a long time of trial and learning from every failure to learn, what could I have done differently in that nanosecond? What can I do the next time that might help me respond in a new way? And so I say to clients all the time, you're fighting powerful chemical forces in your brain that have been there for years and have been reinforced, and your limbic system trumps everything else in your brain, and now you're trying to de-escalate it when the cortisol is pumping and say, choose a different way. So don't beat yourself up if you don't get it right the first time. Keep working, keep learning in each failure until you gradually get new brain circuits that kick into gear in that nanosecond. Now, there's another piece to this that I want you to understand. Fear is the driving thing in this brain. That's not how God designed the brain. God designed the brain for joy and love to be the dominant things. So when you have fear of not getting your needs met, which we talked about last week, fear of getting hurt, that fear, what does it do to a person? It changes the structure of your brain. It sets up thousands and thousands of brain circuits that are all about instant pleasure or instant gratification. But they're really foolish, because down the road they make your life a mess and they hurt a lot of people, including yourself. And so what we have realized as we've studied this is that when fear controls the brain, a person changes and they begin to develop about 60 different ways of coping that children don't normally have when they grow up in a healthy home. And I don't have time to go through all 60. You can go to our website, findingfreedom.ca, and get all of that information. But let me give you a couple things. So a child is in fear. Their needs haven't been met. What are the fears combined in that fear? Number one, maybe the problem is me. Maybe the reason my needs aren't being met is I'm not good enough. I'm not lovable. Maybe everybody's going to reject me just like mom or dad did. That is a huge fear that then takes the person to the next step. Well, then maybe I need to wear masks all the time. Because if people see the real me, they'll reject me too. And I'm afraid of that. And maybe I need to become a people pleaser or a perfectionist. Maybe that's how people will value me and love me and accept me. And then some say, I'm afraid if I trust people, it'll be like mom and dad. I won't get my needs met consistently. So where does that fear take them? Well, I'll just learn to manipulate and control everybody. And so now instead of loving people, I'll use people. Now I will develop a system where I'm constantly working an agenda to try and get my needs met. And then fear of the unknown. If I go into a situation and I don't know exactly what's going to happen, I could get hurt. So I like normal. I like things to stay as they are because at least I know what to expect. So you know what happens for many addicts as they get into recovery? Life starts going well for them. They get their job back, they get their family back, and then they go, uh-oh. In the home I grew up, when everything's going well, the other shoe was about to drop. So you know what? It's going to drop. So let's just sabotage everything good in my life because it's going to get messed up anyways. So they fear even success, and they mess it up. So that's just a handful of the ways that fear changes how a person relates. And it's all limbic brain. Do you realize if you don't trust people, that keeps you safe for now? But in adult life, when you want to have an intimate relationship and you don't trust anybody, it's not going to happen. And if you wear masks now, that keeps you safe now. But in adult life, long term, nobody gets close to you and you never feel connected. So the very limbic solutions end up defeating the person and making their life worse. So the challenge in recovery is taking all 60 of those unhealthy coping styles and relearning how to live in a healthy way. And you can imagine if you've done that to survive, and it did keep you safe in the present, that is really, really hard to relearn. I think the journey of recovery, both with addiction and complex trauma, is one of the hardest journeys in life. Those who have made it, they become beautiful people, but many, many get discouraged on that journey. So let me take you to the second thing that I want to share with you. Many people from complex trauma addiction don't really like Christians or churches very much because they've been given the idea that God judges them, God hates them, God is angry at them, and they get condemned and rejected on a whole bunch of levels by Christians. In John chapter 4, John tells us a story that many of you will be familiar with. It's the woman at the well. Jesus is traveling and he comes to this well at noon and he's very thirsty and tired and he asks the woman there for a drink of water. And then a dialogue ensues and it's a very significant thing. But I want to give you a bit of the backstory of the culture so you can understand exactly what is going on here. The first thing that we're told is that this woman is a Samaritan. The Jewish people hated Samaritans, considered them half-breeds, and they said and believed and taught that God fueled the fires of hell with Samaritans. That's how much they hated them. God's going to keep hell burning with you guys. And when they were traveling from the south of Israel to the north, Samaria was right in the middle. But instead of going right through it, which was the shortest route, they would take a long detour to go around it because they hated them so much. And if they ever stepped foot in Samaria, when they came away from Samaria, they'd shake the dust off their robes so they wouldn't get contaminated by the Samaritans. So this woman's got one strike against her. She's a Samaritan. She's hated by the Jews. Second strike, we're told she has been married 5 times, and she's presently living with a 6th man in her life. And that brings some meaning then to the next thing we're told, and that is she came to the well at noon. Israel is a very hot culture. And so women, after the men went to work in the early morning, they would go to the well to draw water in the cool of the day before it got very hot, because it was a lot of weight to carry home. So why does this woman go at noon? Because she doesn't want anybody else there. she wants to go when nobody else is around. And that tells me something. That tells me that I suspect she probably used to go in the morning. And every time she went, she heard women whispering about her and giving her the evil glance. They heard women taking shots at her, trying to hurt her because maybe she had slept with her boyfriend or with her husband, and they hated her. She had been ostracized, rejected, and they did everything in their power to judge her and make her feel how much they hated her. So here's a very lonely woman. A woman who's lived a very hard life. And now she's all alone. She can't even go and have friendships with other women. She's hated that much. So she goes at lunchtime when nobody else is around to get some water. That is significant because that's how many people coming out of addiction feel. Their life is a mess. They've been judged by so many people and condemned and ostracized and shunned. And it's a very lonely place in early recovery for many. So then we come to Jesus. He comes to the well and he says to the woman, "Please give me a drink." She looks at him and can tell by his clothes that he's a Jew. And she's confused. She says, Jews don't ask Samaritans for a drink of water. And Jews don't drink from the same vessel as a Samaritan is. Nobody would do that. Why are you asking me for water? And then Jesus says something that confuses her. He says, if you knew who I was, you would be asking me for a drink of water. And she doesn't understand that at first until he starts to explain it. And there's two things that he wants her to see. First of all, he says, living water. You need living water. You need more than just this water here. And he's identifying a thirst in her that goes beyond a physical thirst. He is saying that when God gave us our physical desires, so food, water, sex, those physical needs we talked about last week, he gave them to us to alert us to other parts of ourself, our emotions and our spiritual. So if this woman had a drink of water, what she would realize is I'm satisfied physically, but I still feel thirsty somewhere. And so Jesus is saying, I want these physical needs to be road signs that point you to there's something else that I'm made up of besides the physical body. There's a need that is thirsty beyond my physical body. And he's saying this woman had an emotional thirst, a soul thirst, a spiritual thirst. And then if you look at the sex, God gave us sex as a physical intimacy thing. But what he was doing in that, he's saying, don't stop with the physical. You were also created with a desire and a need for emotional intimacy and spiritual intimacy. Physical needs just point you to a deeper part of you. And then Jesus wanted her to see something else. He wanted her to see that she's been soul thirsty for a long time, but she's been trying to satisfy that thirst with the wrong thing. She's been trying to satisfy her thirst with men. She's been hoping if she can get a man to love her, that then she will be satisfied. And she's had one man seem to satisfy, then it went all south. Got rid of him, got another man, seemed to satisfy, then it went all negative. And that was her pattern. And Jesus is saying to her, you're still thirsty, aren't you? You need something more than what a man can give you. You have a thirst that goes deeper than just an emotional thing. You need living water. The New Testament of the Bible was written in the Greek language. And in the Greek language, they have two words for life. Bios, from which we get biology, and Zoe, which many little girls get called. Bios, biology, that's physical life. That's my heart beating. That's my lungs working. That keeps the body alive. But have you ever looked at somebody and they're physically alive, but you look in their eyes and they're dead? That's what this woman was. She had bios, but not Zoe. Zoe is what Jesus is offering her, real life, true life, life that goes beyond physical, life that is emotional and spiritual. And so he is saying, I'm going to offer you a way to finally get Zoe, which you've been trying to get with men. But all you've done is end up with bios, and you're dead inside. And that is what Jesus is offering her. Now, there's one other thing I want you to see. John purposely, when he begins this story, he says that Jesus had to go through Samaria. No Jew would go through Samaria. And so it makes a point, he had to go. What's that all about? That woman, she had heard about the Jews. She lived right next door. She had heard their claim that they had the only true God. And she had heard that since the Jews don't love the Samaritans, the Jews hate the Samaritans, the Jews think all the Samaritans are going to hell, that therefore their God thinks the same thing. And she's not only a Samaritan, she's an immoral woman in their book, so she doesn't stand a chance with this God. And so Jesus is wanting to send a message, and he's saying, I got to go there because there's a woman there who for the first time in her life is acknowledging her soul thirst, and I've got a divine appointment to give her life. And he is saying to that woman, don't believe what the Jews have said about God. That's not the true God. The true God loves the most broken. The true God is all about taking people who are dead inside and offering them living water for the first time in their life. And that is the beauty of what everybody in early recovery needs. God isn't like the God you might have heard about. God is a God who loves people who have tried to fill the thirst of their life with the wrong thing and are now a disaster. And let me take you to the third thing I want you to see. What is the recipe for this Zoe life? How do I get it? Where's this living water? In Matthew 5, Jesus begins his very first sermon. He's at the age of 30. He's just begun his ministry, and he's preaching his very first sermon. In my mind, I go like this. These are going to be the first words coming out of his mouth publicly. I bet you he's going to say something crucial, something foundational. He's going to give us a nugget of wisdom that is designed to be the starting point for building a life that is satisfying. And that's exactly what he does, but it's very confusing because at the very beginning of the very first sermon, he says this, blessed or happy, and he gives us 8 happies. But here's what he says, happy are they who are poor in spirit. Happy are they who cry. Happy are they who are meek. Happy are they who hunger and thirst after righteousness. And we scratch our head and says, that sounds like a recipe for disaster. That sounds like a recipe for misery. So let me give you something here. Jesus is saying a whole bunch of things. Number one, he wants us happy. He wants us to experience his joy. And we are told that God is the blessed, happy God. But secondly, he's wanting us to see that happiness isn't about my external circumstances. I bet you that woman was at a place in her life where she said, the reason I'm not happy is because I married a jerk. And the reason I'm not happy is because none of these women like me. And Jesus is saying, no, happiness isn't about external circumstances. It's about internal attitudes. That is the beginning point of happiness. It's getting your insides right. And it's not about going to church or anything like that. It's about 8 different attitudes. We're only going to look at 4 today that are crucial. And then, next thing he's saying is this. These attitudes aren't just something you say, okay, God, I want to be poor in spirit today, and then tomorrow I'll go back to the way I used to be, and hopefully I'll be happy now. No, he is saying be poor in spirit today and tomorrow and the rest of your life. These attitudes are now supposed to be what your life looks like. They're supposed to be, if you want to be happy, there's got to be a total reorientation internally for the first time that puts you in a different direction. Now think of it in terms of your limbic brain and your cerebral cortex. What does the limbic brain say is its recipe for happiness? Pretty simple. I don't want any rules. I want to be able to do whatever I want. I don't want a boss that tells me what to do. I don't want cops and other authorities that get me in trouble. I want to be my own boss. Then I will be free. And secondly, I want to have whatever I want. I want as much money as I want. I want much sex, food, whatever. I want to just indulge my every want. Then I'll be happy. Now that sounds good in the moment. But what happens long term when you live with only yourself as the boss and you live to satisfy your desires? You're not free. You become a slave to your dark side. You're not happy. You're empty and you're in pain. So the limbic brain picks the wrong recipe for happiness. That's why it's called a foolish brain. What Jesus is saying is a paradox. It seems stupid to the limbic brain. If you want to be happy, be poor in spirit. If you want to be happy, cry. Let me explain what he's actually saying there, because he's looking as a pattern for life that goes against the limbic brain. So the first thing he says, happy are the poor in spirit. In the Greek language, there's 3 different words for poor. The first one is a young couple that has just bought their first house, and they're really tight. They don't have any money for luxuries. They got their needs taken care of, but they're kind of mortgage poor. And we understand that, but that's not the word Jesus is using. Second word, craft dinner poor. You got a single mother on EIA welfare, 6 kids. She can't afford any luxury. She can't even afford basics. Their staple food is craft dinner, and they don't have money for anything else. Now, that's poor. But that's not the word Jesus uses. The word Jesus uses is bankrupt. Somebody that is reduced to having to beg. Somebody that has 0 resources, 0 way of getting resources, and they are at a point where they are so bankrupt, they're just begging for help. Do you want to know what Jesus is saying? He is saying you have to come to a point in your life where you come to the end of yourself. Where you come to a place where you say, God, I can't do it. I can't fix my dark side. I can't fix the problems I've created. I can't stop myself from doing some of the stuff I've been doing that's hurt me, my family, and you, my God. I have tried everything and self-help books galore, but I don't have the resources. I'm begging you for resources. That's what Jesus is saying. That's where a new life that leads to healthiness and happiness begins, by coming to the end of your old way. If you're familiar with the 12 steps that were designed for alcoholics, the first step says this: we admitted that we were powerless. I don't know if you know, but the 12 steps were based on the Beatitudes. And so what an addict is saying, and a person from trauma, is I'm powerless to fix myself. I need resources outside of myself. I can't do it alone. That is the starting point. Then the second one is, happy are those who cry or mourn. Like that woman at the well, most people who find themselves in addiction begin by saying it's everybody else's fault. The reason I'm an addict is that my parents screwed me over, my partner screwed me over, my kids are jerks, all of those things is everybody else's fault. And Jesus is saying, you got to stop blaming and own your part. Yes, your parents wounded you, but you are not going to ever make any progress unless you say, in my adult life, in my teenage years, I kept choosing to do stuff out of my limbic brain that hurt me and that hurt others, but I kept on doing it. I'm the problem. It's not everybody else, it's me that needs to change. And that word for mourning, it goes beyond just a remorse. So many addicts, after they've used and their life is falling apart, they're full of remorse, they hate themselves, they are crying, they're promising they'll never do it again, and then they turn around and do it again. The word that Jesus is saying is a 180-degree turn. They're saying, not only am I feeling remorse, but I'm going to change the direction of my life. because I am the problem and I've been going the wrong direction. That's got to change. And that leads to the third thing. Blessed are the meek. Now, many of you growing up have heard meek is weak. And in our culture, that's what it means, but not in the culture that Jesus was in. Let me explain it. In that culture, when they had horse races, the horse that won the race was considered to be the meekest horse. And that's very interesting. So you got to think of it this way. Two things are necessary for a horse to win a race. Number one, they got to be very powerful. They got to be the strongest horse around. But you realize that a very powerful horse, it can do a lot of damage. It can run everywhere. It can run off the track. So you need a second thing. You need this tiny little guy called a jockey. And this great big powerful horse, which could kill that jockey, chooses to surrender his power to the jockey's control. And what Jesus is saying, you're bankrupt. You can't do it. You've got a point where you're ready to change. Now surrender. Surrender to the greatest cerebral cortex mind in the universe, God. Trust His wisdom. Trust His love. And like a powerful horse, you're not going to get rid of your power. You're just going to surrender it and submit to His rule in your life. That is huge. Step 3 in the 12 steps says, we made a decision to turn our will and our life over to the care of God. We chose to surrender. And then the final one, happy are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. That phrase, hunger and thirst, is very significant. So just imagine that you love pumpkin pie. And so when you go to your mom's for Christmas, Thanksgiving, whatever, you don't just have one piece. You have 2, maybe 3 pieces of pumpkin pie because you love pumpkin pie. And she makes the best. That's not the phrase that Jesus uses. The phrase that Jesus uses has this intensity. I want not just 2 or 3 pieces. I want all the pumpkin pie in the world. That's how great my desire is. And what is Jesus saying? If you're going to make it in this journey, you got to want God more than anything. You got to be willing to go to any lengths to become healthy by His design. When I have people come in to react to the treatment center, the first thing that I'm looking for in them is how badly do they want it. Because if they're just playing at this game, they're not going to make it. If they only want it to get their kids back, they're probably not going to make it. They got to want it more than anything. They got to be willing to give up a whole bunch of things that have trapped them in the old way of living. There has to be a surrender that involves an appetite. Saying, God, I want to know you. I want to become like you. I want that more than anything else in my life. That is going to be my highest desire. And Jesus says, if you get those 4 things, you're on the way to a healthy, happy life. You know what step 4 to 12 is in the 12 steps? It's basically this. I want healthiness more than anything. I'm willing to go to any lengths to be what God designed me to be. So I suspect there's some of you here today that are feeling like that woman at the well. And my prayer and my hope for all of you is that you would be able to take those 4 primary steps to begin this road of recovery. Admit your bankruptcy. Admit you're the problem. Surrender, and then desire Him more than anything else. Let's pray. Father, thank you for giving us this recipe. It's one we never would have figured out on our own. We needed your input, your insight. And I pray for those this morning who are searching, who are thirsty, who realize their bankruptcy, that they would just find all that you have promised in you. Amen. Now we're going to turn it back to the leaders in the warehouse and the fire hall. Thank you.